Bias tape is one of the most luxurious sewing techniques that looks deceitfully very difficult to make. Had I known how easy it is to make my own bias tape and apply it, I would have started using it much sooner than I actually did. So in this video, I want to share tips that will help you master bias tape, create your own, and apply it with confidence to your projects. This video is created in partnership with Mettler, manufacturer of high-quality threads, and all samples you'll see in today's video are made using silk finish cotton 40 thread that now comes in 1000 meter spools. So to master the bias tape, we need to start right at the beginning and understand what is the bias tape and what makes it so special. So as you know, fabric has different parts. At both vertical edges of the fabric, we have selvage that has that very distinctive fabric edge look. Having selvage helps us find other parts of the fabric. Parallel to selvage, we have vertical grain, which is the strongest part of the fabric, and because of that, every sewing pattern has a grain line marking showing how to position pattern detail according to the vertical grain line. At 90 degrees from selvage, we have horizontal grain, where we have horizontal threads crossing vertical ones. Now, if we try to stretch fabric at vertical grain or horizontal grain, we have very little stretch. However, that changes when we try to stretch fabric at 45-degree angle. So at 45-degree angle from selvage, we have bias. And contrary from vertical and horizontal grain, here we have lots of stretch. So you may be thinking, okay, so it has stretch, but what does it actually do? So I want you to join me in a little sewing science experiment, and let's go ahead and cut our fabric into 2 centimeter width straps at 3 different directions. Let's cut at the vertical direction, horizontal grain direction, and at the bias direction. Now that we have 3 straps, same width, same fabric, just cut on different directions, let's try to arch each strap. When we try to do it with vertical cut strap, it has no flexibility and so it does not arch at all. It wants to return into its straight position and forms this gap at the top. Very same thing happens when we try to arch horizontally cut strap, which again ends up with no arch. But when I try to arch the bias cut strap, because of fabric flexibility at this angle, it arches very beautifully, leaving no gap. And if we would add a little bit of heat right here from the iron, we could arch it even more. And this right here shows why the bias cut is so important and so magical. Because of its flexibility, we can apply it even on rounded curves, like finishing necklines, finishing sleeveless armholes or hems. Contrary to vertically or horizontally cut strap, the bias cut will arch very beautifully according to the curve, and you will create that very luxurious finish. I promise you, this is no magic trick. It works with every woven fabric, and it's very easy to try this experiment at home and see for yourself how the bias tape works. So as you can see, what makes the bias tape so special is that it's cut on a 45-degree angle that makes it very flexible. And because of that, creating your own bias tape is very simple. In fact, I do prefer making my own bias tape instead of buying it in store, because in store we have very limited selection of prints of fabric available, and when I'm creating my own bias tape, I can match it with the design that I'm working on, or I can use the scraps and create the bias tape from fabric leftovers. So this is exactly how we're going to make our own bias tape, and it's again all in the cut of the fabric. Begin by finding the fabric selvage, aka the fabric edge, and make sure that it's straight. I'm making sure that the selvage aligns with one of the grids on my cutting mat. Using a ruler with 45-degree angle, I'm positioning the ruler to find the perfect 45-degree angle to selvage and mark it with a marking wheel. Up top, I'm going to mark a few more lines equally spaced and each at the same 45-degree angle. Now the spacing depends on how wide you want the bias tape in the finished result. Now because we're going to fold the edges of the bias tape, you want to go ahead and make the bias tape twice as wide as you want it in the finished bias tape look. Using my long ruler, I'm extending each line to the desired length. Once the lines are marked, I'm going to cut through each of them. In this step, if you're feeling more confident, you can use a rotary cutter. For a lot of users, this is a more faster and easier way how to cut straight lines. At the top, where the lines end, you want to draw a line with 90-degree angle with selvage. This will help cut straps at correct angle, more of which we are going to talk in the next tip. So here we have it, we have cut our bias tapes. If you're enjoying the video so far, please let me know by hitting the like button. This is a little bit of a more technical video, and I would really like to know if you would like to see more of these videos in the future. Now let's continue with our tips. Now to make it easier to install, I'm going to press my bias tape using bias tape makers. I'm going to pull one edge of the tape through the bias tape maker, then pin it to the ironing board. Holding the handle of the bias tape maker, I'm starting to slowly pull it, and as I pull, I immediately press and steam the tape that's coming out. In this step, make sure you're not in a hurry and really taking it slowly and pressing and steaming the tape that's coming out. And that's it, we've very easily and quickly made our own bias tape. Now, if you don't have the bias tape maker, you can still do it. You can either manually fold each edge and press it, or you can pin using heat-resistible pins that usually are glass head pins to the ironing board and then press it. I personally love using the bias tape makers. They're quite cheap. They come in different widths and different sizes, and they're just very cheap and very useful tool to have. They have this handle that protects the hand from the heat, and this is my preferred way how to make my own bias tape. If you want to add the bias tape maker into your tool collection, I will add a link in the description box down below. So as you can see, making your own bias tape is very easy, simple and quick. You're no longer restricted with the selection that you have available in your sewing supply stores, and you can create a bias tape that matches your project ideally. Now, before we move on to me showing how to apply the bias tape, I want to show you how to properly join the edges of the bias tape. And you want to join the edges of the bias tape either before sewing it on your garment to create that very long bias tape, or when you're sewing around the hem, when you want to connect those edges, they need to be cut and sewn properly. And this is how to do it. One common mistake when joining bias tape edges is cutting straight line down at 90-degree angle from the edge. But when we join bias tape cut this way, we lose the flexibility at the seam connection. And because of that, our finish is not going to look right. So instead, we want to maintain that 45-degree edge and cut both edges at 45-degree angle. One tape edge is facing one way and the other faces the other way. When the tapes are joined at this angle, the tape maintains flexibility even at the seam connection, giving you the result that you want. When you're making your own bias tape, again, you can either join multiple bias tapes in advance, and if you cut correctly that top line, you already cut the tape correctly. Or if you're sewing around the hem, around the armhole, around the neckline, when you sew around, just cut those edges in different directions at 45-degree angle and connect them with a short seam. So this is a very simple and very easy rule to remember. When you want to join the edges of the bias tape, remember to cut it at 45-degree angle to maintain the flexibility even on seam connection. So now that we know how to join the edges of the bias tape, let's talk on how to actually apply it to your garment. Now the method that I'm going to show you will work when you want to sew multiple parts of the garment. If you want to finish the rounded neckline on your blouse, if you want to finish the sleeveless armhole on your dress, if you want to finish the asymmetrical curved hem of the skirt, this is where you can use this bias tape method. Unfold one edge of the pre-pressed bias tape and position on the right side of the garment, right sides together. Unfold the tape edge has to go along the fabric edge. Using a straight stitch, sew right at the fold line. You want to start sewing by leaving about 1 centimeter from the edge of the tape so that we can join the edges later. As you sew, navigate the tape so that it follows the fabric edge. Bend the tape where needed so that it follows nicely the edge. If you want, in this step, you can either base stitch or pin your tape prior to sewing it on sewing machine. When you sew around the hem, trim tape at the angle like we did in previous tip, put ends together and connect with the short seam. Now fold tape and all seam allowance to one side and do understitch on the tape about 1-2 millimeters from the tape connection line. This will help keep tape inside of the garment in the finished look. Now fold tape to garment inside so that on the inside you can see a tiny bit of the main fabric and the understitch seam. Using hand base stitch, secure the top of the tape to place. The base stitch will also work as our guide when sewing the next step. Final step is attaching the tape with either invisible hand stitch from the garment inside or top stitch from the right side of the garment. So here's one nuance that I want to emphasize. If you're working on a hem or on curve, where the curve at parts is steeper than at the other parts, on the steepest curve, because of that arch, the bias tape will be slightly more narrow than at spots that are almost straight. And because of that, when you're doing top stitching, you want to make sure that the top stitching is positioned based on the most narrow bias tape point. Top stitch always needs to be sewn at the same distance from the hem edge, so make sure you're positioning your seam according to the most narrow bias tape point, so that when you sew around with your top stitch seam, the entire bias tape is fully secured in place. Using this very simple, very easy method, you can create a very beautiful looking finish on necklines, armholes, or at hems. If you want to create a more interesting look, try using a contrasting color bias tape. Using bias tape, we can also make our own piping, and it's super simple to do. So for this, you want to take a bias cut tape, which is not pre-pressed. Take a piece of thicker cord and wrap it inside the bias tape. We're going to sew close to the cord edge to lock it inside the tape. On your sewing machine, using either a piping presser foot or a sided zipper foot, we're going to sew close to the cord using a straight stitch. And that's it, we have created our own piping. Now, what I like about this particular technique is that it again allows me to create piping that matches my project and my fabric. I am not limited by the piping choice available in the stores, and I can create it even from the leftover fabrics. Additionally, I want to emphasize why we're using the bias cut when we're creating our own piping. And in this particular sample on the skirt pocket, you can see that even though we have very rounded edges, the piping very nicely goes around those rounded edges. I didn't need to cut in the tape, and it's very nicely falls into shape. Had I used a straight cut tape to create this piping, I would have had to make multiple clip ins so that I can actually follow the rounded edges, and at those edges, the top of the piping would have created folds. So remember, if you want to create your own piping, cut the fabric strap at the bias. Using the techniques that I showed in this video, I created this beautiful quilted skirt. This skirt was inspired by wave fields. They have this romantic, calming, and nostalgic feel that I wanted to bring to this design as well. Wavy asymmetric hem mimics the calm movements of wave fields. The hem is also finished using the bias tape method I showed in this video. I also added a pocket for a very romantic feel, and the pocket has a ruffle and piping detail. To add dimension into the design, I added batting material to the inside of the skirt. And I used this beautiful contrasting color thread from Mettler Silk Finish Cotton 40 set to emphasize the way look. What I like about this set is that it comes with these big 1000 meter spools that will last for many, even large scale projects. The colors are very well selected, and kit comes in this useful storage box, making it a great gift choice for a friend that loves sewing. And I also did not resist adding one extra special detail to this skirt. So you know how painters like to sign their paintings? So I had the idea to do the same with this skirt. So I added my name sign at the back of the skirt, and I also sewn it using the very same thread as the way details. Now, because of the bias tape, I was able to create this skirt using very beautiful finishes, and I love how this skirt looks. It's exactly how I envisioned it, and I absolutely loved how it turned out. Thank you for joining me today, and I will see you next time. Bye!